30 years. For 30 long years, Elena Vasquez had fought for this one single moment, only to be laughed at. Imagine pouring your entire life into something, clawing your way up, just to be dismissed like a child telling a fairy tale. That's exactly what happened. But what these ancient, powerful aliens didn't know was that they had just made the biggest mistake of their millennia-long lives. And you're going to want to stick around to see how she gets the ultimate revenge. After decades of brokering treaties and surviving on caffeine and sheer grit, Elena had landed the most important job in human history, asking for a seat at the big kids' table, the Galactic Council. At 52, her hair was more salt than pepper, and the lines around her eyes told stories of countless sleepless nights. But her mind? It was sharper than ever. Her resolve was like forged steel, and she believed in humanity's future out here among the stars with every fiber of her being. She'd spent the last 6 months in a grueling crash course on the customs of 412 different alien species. She didn't just memorize trade stats and histories, she lived and breathed them until she could give her whole speech perfectly in her sleep. Humanity had paid its dues, and Elena was here to collect. The ship's captain, David Chen, a man whose calm expression hid a deep-seated loyalty, appeared at her door. He'd been her right hand for 15 years. "We're nearing the council station, Ambassador," he said, his voice steady. "We'll be docking in about 2 hours." Elena nodded, her focus absolute. "Thanks, Captain. I'm ready." She turned back to the window, watching the star-dusted velvet of space slide by. Out there was the heart of the galaxy, a station that had been orbiting for 11,000 years, a silent testament to powers older than human writing, older than our first cities. And today, Elena Vasquez, a representative from a species they saw as cosmic toddlers, was about to walk into their sacred halls and demand they take her seriously. She took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. The real council station made the holograms look like a child's crayon drawing. It wasn't a station. It was a floating jewel the size of a city, a moon made of crystal spires that seemed to drink the light from a nearby star. Hundreds of alien ships zipped around it like bees around a cosmic flower. Next to them, the Aurora looked like a bathtub toy. Let's be honest, our technology was a joke by their standards. While they were bending space and time, we were still proud of our glorified bottle rockets. Their shields could phase through asteroids. Ours were basically just strong magnets. We were the babies of the galaxy, just figuring out how to crawl while everyone else was running marathons. But you have to start somewhere. Elena handled the docking protocols like a pro, her words flowing smoothly thanks to a tiny device tucked behind her ear. It was a gift from the Minari, one of the first species to trade with us about 40 years ago. A little friendly gesture that was about to become incredibly important. With it, a universal translator kicked in, allowing her to understand everyone and letting them understand her in return. But nothing could have prepared her for what was inside the station. The hallways were so massive they could accommodate any creature you could dream up, from tiny, glittering beings that could dance on the palm of her hand, to gargantuan life forms that could have swallowed her starship whole. The very walls felt like they were alive, shimmering with colors that shifted to match the emotions of the beings passing by. The air itself was a perfectly balanced chemical soup, engineered to let dozens of different species breathe at the same time. Elena's guide was a sleek, silent robot that just floated ahead, leading her through winding corridors, past alien markets overflowing with goods, and into gardens growing impossible plants from 1,000 different worlds. She saw species she'd only ever seen in textbooks. The Vorthani, giant floating jellyfish who communicated by changing colors. The Kali, beings made of pure energy trapped inside elegant crystal bodies. And the bug-like Zilvari, whose leader, the High Arbiter, was the final word on just about everything. And for every species she recognized, there were a dozen more that were completely new. She saw creatures that looked like they were made of living fire, beings that seemed to be carved from solid ice, and some things so utterly alien, her mind just short-circuited trying to figure them out. And every single one of them stopped what they were doing to stare as she, the little human, walked by. Elena kept her head held high, her expression calm and unreadable. She was the voice for 8 billion people back home. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her sweat. The grand chamber was something else entirely. The ceiling was so high it disappeared into a soft, glowing mist, and the walls were lined with thousands upon thousands of seats, rising up into the heavens. Every single one of the 412 member species was there, a breathtaking mosaic of life in every shape and color you could imagine. And right in the center, on a raised platform, sat the High Council. These were the 5 most powerful beings in the galaxy, from the oldest races, the ones who had been writing the laws for thousands of years. What they said, went. In the center seat sat High Arbiter Zilvex, a Zilvari who'd held his position for over 300 years. His insect-like body was covered in ceremonial metals that glinted under the soft light. His enormous compound eyes reflected her image 1,000 times as she approached the petitioner's podium. The podium was just a simple bare platform right in the middle of this gigantic room. As was human custom for an event this big, she walked to it alone, one person, speaking for an entire world. The moment she reached the center and stopped, a deep, profound silence fell over the chamber. Every eye in every form was locked on her. High Arbiter Zilvex's voice echoed through the space, instantly translated in her ear. The Galactic Council acknowledges the representative from the planet known as Earth. State your name and your purpose. Elena took a slow, steadying breath. My name is Ambassador Elena Vasquez, and I represent the United Earth Confederacy. I stand before this respected council to formally petition for humanity to be granted associate membership in the Galactic Council. A quiet murmur rippled through the massive crowd. Elena knew this was coming. Asking for associate membership right off the bat was a bold, almost arrogant move for a young species like them, but she was confident they were ready. The Council has heard Earth's petition, Zilvex said. You may make your case. Elena tapped her wrist, and a hologram of our beautiful, swirling blue planet bloomed in the air. Humanity has only been traveling the stars for 63 years, she began. In that short time, we've built colonies on 3 different worlds. We developed faster than light travel, created artificial gravity, and our medical breakthroughs have added 30 years to our lives. The hologram shifted, showing humans working alongside aliens, our ships filled with goods for trade, our diplomats shaking hands, or tentacles, or claws with a dozen different species. We have peaceful trade agreements with 47 species. We've contributed to critical research in everything from quantum physics to xenobiology. We have shared our art, our music, and our stories with anyone willing to listen, and we have eagerly embraced the cultures of others. The image changed one last time, now showing human soldiers fighting alongside alien allies against space pirates. We have also done our part to keep the galaxy safe. Human volunteers have served in 12 different peacekeeping missions over the last 20 years. We have lost over 1,000 of our people defending species we had barely even met. Elena let the hologram fade, the silence feeling heavy in the air. She looked up, trying to meet the gaze of the thousands of beings watching her. We are young. We know this. We know we're still learning and have a long way to go. But we believe our youth is our greatest strength, not a weakness. We can offer a fresh perspective, new ideas, and a way of looking at the universe that can help everyone here. Her voice got stronger, filled with passion. Humanity is not here asking for a handout. We are asking for a partnership. We want a seat at this table, not because we think we're entitled to it, but because we truly believe we have earned the right to be heard. She bowed her head respectfully. The United Earth Confederacy formally requests associate membership in the Galactic Council. We offer our friendship, our complete cooperation, and our absolute commitment to peace and prosperity for every species. Elena finished her speech and stood in silence. She'd said all she could. The ball was in their court now. High Arbiter Zilvex's multifaceted eyes seemed to glitter. The Council has heard Earth's petition. The floor is now open for discussion. For one long, tense moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a booming voice echoed from one of the upper levels. 63 years? It was the Vorthani delegate, the giant jellyfish. its body pulsing with a color her translator identified as pure, condescending amusement. These creatures have had faster-than-light travel for 63 of their little planetary circles, and they actually think that makes them qualified to join us? And then it started. Laughter. It was a horrifying symphony of clicks, whistles, shimmering lights, and weird vibrations, but the meaning was universal and unmistakable. They were mocking her, mocking all of humanity. Elena felt a hot wave of anger flash through her, but on the outside, her face was a mask of ice. Can you believe their entire species still tells time by the spin of a single planet? The Vorthani delegate sneered, its voice oozing with contempt. They haven't even bothered to get with the program and use the galactic standard calendar. The laughter started to swell. Then another voice, this one from the Krail delegate, a being made of pure energy trapped in a crystal shell, chimed in. Aren't these the same creatures who nearly wiped themselves out playing with nuclear fission? They split the atom, and the very first thing they did was build a bomb. They used it on their own cities. The laughter turned into a thunderous roar. They can't even get their own house in order, bellowed a four-armed creature from the hegemony of 12 stars. Their tiny world is split into 193 competing nations. They haven't even achieved global unity. Then from the back, a final shout of disgust. They eat the flesh of other living things. Imagine your entire species being put on trial by the galaxy, only for them to decide you're a complete joke. They called humanity fragile, short-lived animals who feel pain, waste a third of their lives unconscious, and spend their free time getting burned by their own star. The Grand Chamber, home to 412 alien species, absolutely erupted in laughter. If you think that sounds like the ultimate injustice, stick around and see how one human's silent response would change the course of history forever. Standing there at the podium, Elena felt those waves of mockery crash over her, and something deep inside her just snapped. She'd come ready for arguments, for tough negotiations, even for a flat-out rejection. But she was not prepared for this. This wasn't a debate. It was pure, unfiltered disgust for everything it meant to be human. Her gaze swept across the ocean of alien faces. A few were silent, their expressions unreadable, but the overwhelming majority were howling like it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. They looked at her and saw a funny little pet, not an equal. The jeering went on for almost 10 solid minutes before the High Arbiter, Zilvex, finally raised one of his limbs to call for silence. Slowly, the chamber quieted down, but you could still hear chuckles and snickers echoing in the massive hall. The Council appreciates humanity's enthusiasm, Zilvex said, his mandibles clicking together in what passed for a dry, insect-like laugh. It's always so charming to see a young race so eager to sit at the grown-ups' table. His compound eyes stared right through Elena. However, he went on, we have to consider the larger picture. Membership in this council requires a species to show a certain level of maturity, unity, and overall value. Humanity, while spirited, is simply too young, too chaotic, and far too primitive. He spread his upper arms in a way that was probably meant to be sympathetic, but just felt incredibly condescending. Maybe in another 1,000 years, after your people have had some time to grow up, you can apply again. For now, we suggest you go back to your little corner of the galaxy and, try not to blow yourselves up. His mandibles clicked one last time, sending a final ripple of laughter through the room, and Elena just stood there, completely motionless. She let the sound wash over her. In her 30 years as a diplomat, she had been insulted, brushed off, and laughed at more times than she could even remember. But never, not once, like this. In that moment, something inside her turned to solid ice. She had walked in here hoping to build a partnership. She had truly believed that if she could just present her case well enough, they would recognize humanity's potential, that a shared destiny among the stars was within reach. That dream died right then and there, drowned in a tidal wave of alien laughter. As the noise finally started to die down, Elena reached up and ripped the universal translator from behind her ear. The little device wasn't made to be removed like that. A sharp, burning pain shot through her head, but she didn't so much as wince. She held the small piece of tech in her hand, this tiny symbol of all her people's hopes and ambitions. Then, with slow, deliberate precision, she placed it on the podium. The room went completely silent. This was not part of the ceremony. No one had ever done that before. Elelina raised her head and stared out at the combined might of the galaxy. 412 species, 11,000 years of shared history, the wisdom of 1,000,000 star systems, and not a single one of them saw humanity as anything more than a child. She didn't say a single word. What was the point? They'd already made their judgment. No powerful speech she could deliver would ever change their minds about humans being insignificant little primitives. So she gave them nothing but silence. And then, Elena Vasquez turned her back on the entire Galactic Council. In the huge, silent chamber, her footsteps echoed as she walked toward the exit. Her back was perfectly straight, her head held high. She never looked back, not even for a second. As the massive doors hissed shut behind her, the laughter in the grand chamber was well and truly dead, replaced by a stunned, confused silence. In the Council's whole 11,000-year history, no species applying for membership had ever just left. They would plead, they would bargain, they would get angry, they would break down and cry, but they never, ever just turned around and walked away. High Arbiter Zilvex's mandibles clicked with a hint of uncertainty. "The petition is denied," he announced, but his voice didn't have the same confidence it had before. "Let us move on." But the entire feeling in the room had shifted. The next speaker couldn't hold anyone's attention. Delegates were whispering to each other, their eyes darting toward the doors where the human ambassador had just disappeared. It didn't make any sense. Humanity was a galactic nobody, a flash-in-the-pan species from a backwater planet. They held no real power, no influence worth mentioning. And yet, as the session continued, delegate after delegate found their minds wandering back to that silent walk, that defiant posture, and that look of absolute chilling composure. It was deeply unsettling. Aboard her ship, the Aurora, Elelina Vasquez sat alone in the quiet of her cabin. They had detached from the station the moment she was on board and were already making the long journey home. The captain had tried to speak with her, but she had just waved him away. She needed a moment to think. The throbbing pain behind her ear was starting to fade, but it was being replaced by the much deeper ache of total failure. All that work, all that hope, for nothing. The Council would never accept them as equals. Not in 1,000 years, not in 10,000. To them, humans were just amusing little animals, like ants building a funny-looking sandcastle right before a tidal wave comes to wash it all away. But as Elena stared out at the endless field of stars, that pain slowly started to harden into something else entirely. She was no stranger to failure. Every diplomat knows that failure is just the price you pay to gain wisdom. And the lesson she learned today? It was painfully clear. She replayed the laughter, the arrogance, and the absolute certainty in their eyes that humanity was and always would be beneath them. They were so very wrong. She knew what her people could do when they were united. She'd seen them go from riding horses to walking on their moon in a single human lifetime. She'd seen them survive world wars, plagues, and natural disasters that should have wiped them off the map. She knew their greatest strength was a stubborn, bone-deep refusal to ever give up. The Council saw humanity's youth and called it a weakness. They saw their internal squabbles and called them primitive. They saw their need for sleep and their short lifespans and called them pathetic. They just didn't get it. Humans weren't weak. They were incredibly resilient. They weren't primitive. They were masters of adaptation. And they weren't pathetic. They were patient, unbelievably patient. A new plan began to take shape in her mind. She would go home and tell every single person exactly what happened. She would describe the mockery, the condescension, the absolute and total dismissal. And then she would propose a new path forward. The Council wanted humanity to develop in peaceful isolation? Great. They would do exactly that. But not in the way the Council was picturing. Humanity would grow. It would get stronger. It would build a civilization that didn't need anyone's damn permission to exist. And one day, when the Council finally woke up and realized what a massive mistake they'd made, humanity would be ready for them. They would remember this day. They would remember the laughter. Looking out at the endless expanse of space, Elena Vasquez finally allowed herself to smile. The council had absolutely no idea what it had just set in motion. Meanwhile, back in the Grand Chamber, hours after the session had ended, High Arbiter Zilvex sat all alone. The Great Hall was now empty and silent. He knew he should be resting for the next day's boring cycle of petitions and arguments, but his mind kept going back to the human. It was absurd. She was a single representative from a backwards little world. Insignificant. Her species would most likely destroy itself within a few generations, just like so many other young races did. But he couldn't get the image of that walk out of his head, that silent, proud exit. In his 300 years serving on the council, Zilvex thought he had seen everything. He'd seen rage and sadness, dignity and fury. He had never, ever seen a petitioner just turn their back and leave. In those final moments, he'd seen something in the human's eyes he couldn't quite identify. It wasn't anger, and it wasn't defeat. It was something far more disturbing. It looked like patience. Zilvex made a rasping noise to dismiss the thought. It meant nothing. The human meant nothing. In 1,000 years, no one would even remember this day. He pushed himself up and left the chamber, determined to forget about the whole thing. But deep in his ancient mind, a tiny, nagging alarm had just started to ring, a warning he wouldn't truly understand for a very, very long time. For the first year after the incident, nothing really changed. Humanity had never been a big deal on the galactic scene anyway. They had a few remote trading posts, a couple of scientific exchange programs, and they showed up at the occasional summit, mostly just to stand in the corner. One day, they were just gone. Human ships vanished from the docking logs at council spaceports. Their delegates' seats at interspecies summits were suddenly empty. The handful of human exchange students attending off-world universities quietly packed up and went home without so much as a goodbye. And honestly, nobody really gave it a second thought. Humanity was a minor league player in a galactic big league. Their disappearance was less than a drop in the ocean. But back on Earth, that drop was a tsunami. The very second Ambassador Elena Vasquez's transport touched down from the council station, she called for an emergency session with the entire leadership of the United Earth Confederacy. She stood before them, her expression carved from granite, and laid out exactly what went down. She didn't spare them a single detail. Every condescending laugh, every whispered insult. The footage of that meeting was blasted on every screen on the planet. Billions of humans watched as representatives from 412 alien species openly laughed at their formal request to join the galactic community. They saw their ambassador physically rip the translator implant from her ear, the ultimate diplomatic mic drop, and stride out of a chamber that had fallen into a stunned silence. And then, Elena Vasquez laid out her plan. "They're waiting for us to just go away," she said. "They're betting that we'll either start a war among ourselves or spend the next 1,000 years begging for another chance. They see us as toddlers who will cry for a bit and then come crawling back, pleading for table scraps." Her eyes, once known for their diplomatic warmth, were now like frozen steel. They have made a catastrophic miscalculation. The plan itself was shockingly simple in its idea, but absolutely massive in its scale. Humanity would go dark. They would cut off all communication with the galactic community. No more trade proposals, no more showing up to pointless parties, and no more asking for a single thing from races who thought they were a joke. From this moment on, humanity would look inward. Every single resource, every ounce of effort would be funneled into one singular objective: progress. They would rocket their technology forward by any means they could. They would carve out new territory, build up their military might, and forge a civilization so powerful and self-reliant it would never need to ask anyone for permission again. And the most critical part of the plan? They would do it all in complete, total, and deafening silence. "They made fun of us for tracking time by the spin of our tiny world," Elena said, a cold smile touching her lips. "Let's see how they enjoy being ignored for a few rotations of their own home planets." The proposal passed with not one single vote against it. the United Earth Confederacy sent out one final, galaxy-wide transmission. It was brief, professional, and had an ice-cold politeness to it. The United Earth Confederacy extends its thanks to its galactic partners for their cooperation over these past few decades. Due to a period of internal reorganization, we will be scaling back our external affairs for the foreseeable future. We wish all species ongoing peace and prosperity. And that was it. No rage, no pointing fingers, no melodrama, just quiet. It was about 2 years later that the rest of the galaxy started to get a little curious. The first sign that something was off came when Delegate Minara of the Hegemony of 12 Stars was looking over a trade summary. For generations, the hegemony had a small but incredibly profitable arrangement with human farming colonies. It turned out humans had an almost supernatural gift for coaxing crops out of the most worthless soil. Their agricultural methods had single-handedly rescued several of the hegemony's dying farm worlds. Now, those same worlds were collapsing all over again. Has anyone followed up with the humans about renewing the farming exchange program? Minara asked his team. We have dispatched 12 official inquiries over the last 8 months, his aide said, nervously tapping his data slate. They send back a confirmation that they received the message and that's all. Nothing else? What in the stars is that supposed to mean? It means, sir, that a digital receipt is sent to confirm our message arrived. They just don't answer the message itself. Minara was completely stumped. This wasn't how things were done. You send an offer, they send a counteroffer, you haggle. You don't just not reply. Around that same time, the Vorthani hive minds hit a very similar brick wall. For decades, the Vorthani had been quietly depending on human mathematicians to solve a very particular kind of problem. The Vorthani were brilliant at almost everything, but their collective consciousness had a few peculiar blind spots. Humans, with their chaotic individual minds, could see elegant patterns that the Vorthani just couldn't. It was a minor deal, just a handful of complex equations every couple of months. The humans seemed to like the mental puzzle, and the Vorthani paid them with little pieces of advanced technology. But now, a backlog of unsolved equations was growing. The Vorthani's deep space navigation network, which depended on those calculations, started to get buggy. Starships began arriving days behind schedule. Whole supply chains started to unravel. What began as a minor inconvenience was quickly becoming a full-blown logistical catastrophe. Get in touch with the humans, the Vorthani Council commanded. Offer them whatever they want. The message was sent. The receipt was returned. And then, silence. By year 5, the human question was a major topic of conversation in the council chambers. Seriously, has anyone successfully closed a deal with the humans recently? The Krelath delegate asked during a casual meeting. The only response was the sound of uncomfortable shifting. We offered them top-tier technology transfers, Delegate Minara added. We offered them enormous trade advantages. We even offered to personally sponsor a new petition for their membership. They simply do not respond. Maybe they finally had that atomic war they were always rambling on about and just blew themselves up, someone mumbled. It actually sounded pretty likely, but they were wrong. Long-range spy drones sent to the border of human-controlled space painted a completely different picture. Earth was thriving. In fact, their colonies were expanding at an incredible rate, and their ships were darting around their own territory, busier than ever. They just weren't speaking to anyone outside of it. This is absurd, the Vorthani delegate gurgled during a council meeting in year 8. They're behaving like petulant children, like a grub larva hiding in a corner after being told no. High Arbiter Zilvex, the leader of the council, clicked his mandibles together thoughtfully. They have not broken any laws, he pointed out. They have not made any threats. They have merely decided not to talk to us. Then force them to talk. And by what right? Zilvex shot back. The council has no authority to compel a species to be our friend. We could blockade their trade routes. What trade routes? They don't trade with anybody. Then we threaten them with our armada. Zilvex's compound eyes seemed to shimmer with something that looked like amusement. Against a species that hasn't made one hostile move in 8 years? The council would never approve such a baseless attack. And really, what's the point? They're an irrelevant species. Let them pout in their little corner of the galaxy. But even as he said it, Zilvex felt a strange knot of dread in his gut. There was something about the sheer discipline of the human silence that was profoundly unnerving. The 10th year delivered the catastrophe that flipped the entire galaxy upside down. The Thresh were a plague from the empty void between galaxies. They would pour out of the darkness every few thousand years and just consume everything in their path. You couldn't make a deal with them. You couldn't reason with them. They were a cosmic force of nature. The Council had driven them back before. The combined fleets of 400 species had always been just enough to push them back into the void, though the price was always staggering. This time, things were different. The Thresh had adapted. Their weapons, which had always been a nuisance, now tore through the Council's most advanced shields like they were tissue paper. Their ships, which were once few in number, now blotted out the stars in unending swarms. The first engagement was a slaughter. 17 council fleets, the pride and joy of 300 different civilizations, were annihilated in less than 24 hours. The handful of ships that managed to escape brought back bone-chilling reports. None of their weapons could even make a dent in the enemy's armor. The second engagement was a bloodbath. A panicked emergency session was convened. Military leaders from every species worked non-stop, desperate for any weakness, any strategy, any sliver of hope. They found absolutely nothing. The Thresh pushed deeper and deeper into Council space. 3 capital planets fell. Their populations weren't just conquered, they were erased. Billions of lives were extinguished in a matter of hours. "We are out of ideas," the Council's Supreme General announced, his voice thick with despair. "We need new strategies, new technologies. We need a way of thinking about conflict that we have never even imagined." "The humans," a small voice whispered from the back of the hall. Every single head in the chamber whipped around. "The humans," the diplomat said again, taking a step forward. He was from some forgotten world, the kind of representative nobody ever bothered to remember. Their entire history is little more than a catalog of warfare. They are creative in their approach to destruction in ways that, let's be honest, most of us find deeply unsettling. It's possible they might see an opening that we are all missing. A dead, heavy silence filled the chamber. Everyone in that room remembered the day of laughter. Everyone remembered pointing and sneering and dismissing the pathetic little species from the insignificant blue planet. "They won't listen to us," Delegate Minara said, his voice flat. "We've been trying to get a simple trade response for years. They will not answer. This is not about trade. Trillions of lives hang in the balance. You have to try again. Offer them the galaxy, full council membership, a seat at the high table, technology, star systems, whatever they want. Just make them answer." The most desperate plea in the history of the galaxy was written up and beamed toward Earth. It explained the full, terrifying scope of the Thresh invasion. It was a desperate, groveling request for help. It offered humanity everything they had once been laughed at for asking for. A few minutes later, the reply came back. Acknowledgement of receipt. And then, once again, there was nothing but silence. The Thresh fleets burned ever closer. The galaxy was burning. 5 more worlds had been snuffed out like candles, and now the swarm was heading straight for the shining capital station of the Council itself. For the first time in 11,000 years, the Galactic Council was staring down total annihilation. And in a final, desperate move, High Arbiter Zilvex decided to do the unthinkable. He was going to Earth alone. No one fired on him. No threatening messages warned him away. A sleek, powerful-looking human warship simply blinked into existence, matching his speed and escorting him in complete radio silence as it guided him into orbit. Zilvex had never laid eyes on the human homeworld before. He gazed down at the swirling blue and green sphere, at the glittering webs of city lights stretched across the dark side, and was struck with a profound sense of awe. A shuttle ferried him down to a stunning complex of elegant buildings that overlooked a massive stretch of water the locals called the Pacific Ocean. He was greeted by silent guards in crisp, sharp uniforms who led him through minimalist hallways that were absolutely spotless. Finally, he was brought into a large office where a woman was sitting behind a massive desk, focused on her work. Time had touched Elena Vasquez. Her hair, once black, was now mostly silver, and the lines of command were etched deep into her face. She wasn't an ambassador anymore. She was the Secretary General of the entire United Earth Confederacy. The very woman who had been laughed out of the Grand Chamber now held the fate of her people in her hands, and she looked up as Zilvex, the most powerful being in the galaxy, walked into her office. Her eyes held no anger, no hatred. They held something far more chilling. They were completely empty. "Hello, Arbiter," she said, her voice civil but as cold as the void between stars. "How can I help you?" Zilvex spilled everything. The terrifying threat they called the Thresh, the staggering number of lives lost, and how desperately they needed a new strategy, a fresh pair of eyes, before everything was gone. He spoke for nearly an hour, holding nothing back. He confessed their mistakes, their overconfidence, even their fear, admissions no arbiter had ever made to an outsider. Through it all, Elena just listened, impossibly still. When he finished, she simply gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I see," she said. "That certainly sounds serious." "It is," he pleaded, leaning forward. "Billions are dead. Billions more will follow if we can't stop them. We need your help." "I understand," was her only reply. The silence that fell between them was so heavy it felt like a physical weight. Zilvex waited. He had come ready to negotiate, to haggle over terms and conditions. He had not prepared for this utter emptiness. "Secretary General," he said, his voice tight with strain, "I am begging for your help. The entire Galactic Council is begging. What is it you want from us?" Elena rose from her chair and walked to the window. The sun bled across the water in streaks of gold and fire as it sank below the horizon. She just watched it for a second. "Arbiter," she finally said, her voice surprisingly soft. "Do you recall what took place in the Grand Chamber 15 years ago?" "I remember the session," he replied. "Your request was denied." "You laughed at us," she said, her voice staying perfectly, unnervingly level. "All 412 species. You laughed so hard your own translation system struggled to process it. Then you told us to try again in 1,000 years. Secretary General, you can't possibly be thinking of letting an old insult get in the way of saving countless innocent lives." "It wasn't an insult," Elena said, turning to look right at him, her eyes carrying a chilling, empty weight. "It was a lesson. You taught us something incredibly valuable that day. You showed us our exact place in this galaxy, and we took that lesson to heart. We may have acted hastily. It's possible we would welcome humanity's membership now, full membership, effective immediately." Elena's smile was a razor's edge, all sharp angles and no warmth. "Hi, Arbiter. I'm about to say something, and I need you to understand that I am being 100% sincere." She took a small step toward him. "We don't want your membership. We don't want your trade agreements, your technology, or your approval. We want absolutely nothing from you." His 3 hearts pounded against his ribs. "So you're just going to sit back and watch billions of people die?" Elena paused for a moment. "When we left that chamber," she said at last, "we made a vow. We would never again depend on anyone who could look down on us and laugh. We would never again ask for a seat at a table where we weren't wanted. We spent the last 15 years building something for ourselves, something that has no need for your counsel." "Building what?" he shot back. "That is no longer any of your concern." Elena returned to her desk and tapped a control. "Your escort is ready to return you to your ship. I wish you a safe trip home." Zilvex was floored. In 11,000 years, nobody had ever said no to the Council, not to a treaty, not to a trade deal, but to the very concept of a conversation. "You can't be serious," he sputtered. "This is insanity. We are offering you everything you ever asked for." 15 years too late," she replied, picking up a data pad and dismissing him as if the most powerful man in the known universe was nothing more than an annoying fly. "Goodbye, High Arbiter." Zilvex was escorted off the planet, shrouded in a silence that was more deafening than any explosion. As his ship warped away from Earth's orbit, he stared at the small blue world. It looked the same as it had in the holograms from years ago, tiny, unassuming. But he now understood that something fundamental had shifted. The humans were no longer asking for permission, and a cold dread washed over Zilvex as he realized that was infinitely more terrifying than any monster the Thresh could ever produce. He returned to the council and delivered his report. The chamber erupted in outrage. How dare those humans refuse them? How dare they put their petty pride before the fate of the entire galaxy? It just went to show what they had said all along. Humans were selfish, primitive, and completely unworthy. But all their screaming and shouting changed nothing. The humans remained silent, and the Thresh continued their relentless advance. In the end, the council survived, but just barely. It took another 3 years and cost them 17 entire species, completely wiped from the cosmic map. 43 worlds were scorched into cinders. Civilizations that had flourished for millennia were gone in the blink of an eye. The Grand Alliance that had maintained peace for 11,000 years was left shattered, diminished, and deeply humbled. And through it all, humanity did nothing. Their ships would occasionally appear at the edge of a battle, silent observers who never lifted a finger to help but also never interfered. They would rescue survivors from the twisted wreckage, regardless of species, drop them off at a neutral port, and then melt back into the darkness. They never fired a shot. They never demanded payment. But the people they saved all told the same bizarre stories. The human ships were different. They moved in ways that should have been physically impossible. They could appear from thin air and vanish just as quickly. Their hulls seemed to ripple and shimmer, as if they weren't quite in the same reality as everything else. At first, these accounts were written off as the ramblings of traumatized survivors. Everyone knew human technology was clumsy and crude. But the reports kept coming in, and they were all eerily consistent. The humans had changed. No one knew how it happened. No one knew why. But in those 15 years of silence, something had occurred. Something that was about to rock the galaxy to its very core. The Thresh War finally sputtered to an end in the 18th year of humanity's silence. The galaxy that remained was a ghost of its former glory. Where 412 species once gathered in the Grand Chamber, only 395 were left. 17 civilizations had been erased forever. Their planets were now cosmic graveyards. Their people, just memories. Their entire histories were reduced to data files in the Council archives. 43 additional worlds had been obliterated. Billions upon billions were dead. Ancient alliances had fractured under the immense pressure of the war. Friendships that had lasted for generations were destroyed by finger-pointing and suspicion. The Galactic Council still existed, but it was a hollowed-out shell of what it once was. Its authority was weak, and its commands were frequently questioned. Species that had once been allies now watched each other with wary eyes. And through every moment of this galactic collapse, humanity had stayed silent. They didn't help, but they didn't cause harm either. They just observed from afar, saving who they could, but refusing to enter the fray. Their silence became the stuff of legend. Some branded them cowards, others whispered that they were wise, but most people just tried their best not to think about them at all. The only problem was, ignoring humanity was becoming more and more difficult. The stories from the war survivors hadn't died down. In fact, they were becoming more detailed and even more unbelievable. Human ships that seemed to laugh at the laws of physics, technology that worked like pure magic, power readings that were so high they broke the scales, far beyond anything the Council had ever recorded. A top scientist, Chief Technician Aldara, was assigned to investigate. She was a being of pure energy, one of the most brilliant minds in the galaxy, who had spent 2 centuries studying the fundamental rules of the universe. Her findings were simply impossible. These readings suggest their ships operate on principles we can't even begin to understand, she reported to the Science Committee. It's less like they're flying through space and more like they're just stepping around it. And their energy signatures? There is absolutely nothing like them in our entire database. How can that be? The committee chair blared. 18 years ago, they were still using primitive chemical rockets. They were centuries behind us. I don't have an answer for how, Aldara pulsed. I only know what the data is telling me. Then your data is flawed. It must be glitches from damaged sensors. Aldara's energy form flared bright with frustration. I have cross-referenced over 300 separate incidents. The data is consistent across all of them. So either every single survivor of the Thresh War experienced the exact same impossible equipment malfunction, or the humans now possess technology so far beyond our own that we can't even imagine it. The committee refused to accept it. They voted to classify her report as unreliable and buried it in the deepest, darkest corner of the archives. You can't run from the truth forever. 2 years after the Big War, a rebellion sparked against the iron-fisted hegemony of 12 stars. This wasn't exactly front-page news. The hegemony was an empire built on crushing dissent, so uprisings were pretty much a regular Tuesday for them. And they were always stamped out. This time, the fire started on a tiny world called Valen 4. The people there, the Cathari, were a gentle species who'd been living under the hegemony's boot for generations. They'd suffered in silence for centuries, but the losses from the last galactic war were the final straw. They rose up and demanded to be free. The hegemony's reaction was as predictable as the sunrise. They sent a fleet to turn their world into a parking lot. 30 colossal warships, armed with enough power to shatter the planet, descended on Valen 4. The Cathari didn't have an army. Their options were grim: surrender or be erased. But as the fleet dropped out of hyperspace, they found someone had beaten them to it. Human ships were already there. On the bridge of her flagship, Commander Thera could not believe what she was seeing. 3 small human ships were just hanging in orbit over Valen 4, positioned squarely between her massive fleet and the planet. Logically, they were nothing more than a speed bump. But every battle-honed instinct in Thera's body was screaming that this was a terrible, terrible mistake. Then, a calm voice sliced through the tension on an open channel. This is Captain Sarah Chen of the UEC Endeavour. Imagine being told you're just a neutral observer there to protect civilians. That's the story Commander Thera was getting. But Thera was a veteran of 100 brutal campaigns. She wasn't about to be lectured by 3 insignificant human ships. She didn't see a peacekeeping force. She saw a profound insult. "Human vessel," she broadcast, her voice dripping with scorn. "You are trespassing in hegemony territory during a military operation. Leave now, or you will be fired upon." The human response was infuriatingly calm and simple. "Negative, Commander. We're not going anywhere." Thera actually paused for a second. The Council had always urged caution when dealing with humans, especially since they'd gone quiet. "Let the sleeping giant lie," the diplomats always said. But this was her space, her rules. Thera had her orders and, more importantly, her pride. "All ships," she commanded, a cruel smirk spreading across her face. "Target the human vessels. Open fire." 30 warships unleashed a storm of pure destruction. Lances of blinding plasma, clouds of antimatter missiles, and crushing gravity beams. Enough destructive force to crack a moon in half, all screamed toward the 3 tiny ships. And then, the impossible happened. Everything just stopped. The entire apocalyptic assault froze in the dead of space, like a photograph of a hurricane. Every last missile, every single energy bolt hung there for a heartbeat. And then it all turned around. The hegemony's own firepower was now heading straight back at them, perfectly reversing its path. In 13 seconds, 30 warships went dead. Not blown to smithereens, just turned off. As the dim emergency lights flickered on, Thera was shocked to feel a wave of relief. Her crew was alive. Their weapon systems were fried, their engines were offline, their shields were gone, but the ships themselves were unharmed. They were sitting ducks. Right on cue, shuttles began to pour from the 3 human ships. They zipped down to Valen 4 and began evacuating the Cathari civilians. Thousands of people who had been preparing to die were now being gently escorted onto transport ships and carried away to safety. The mighty hegemony fleet, 30 of the most feared warships in the galaxy, could do nothing but float there, powerless, and watch the whole thing. Hours later, after the last civilian was clear, one final message came from the humans. The United Earth Confederacy has no desire for a war with the hegemony of 12 stars. But we will not stand by while innocent people are slaughtered. We recommend you find a more peaceful way to solve your internal disputes. The message was signed, Captain Sarah Chen, UEC Endeavour. And just like that, the human ships were gone. They didn't jump to lightspeed. They didn't fly away. They just vanished, as if they were never even there. Commander Thera sat on her dark, silent bridge, struggling to process what had just happened. Her entire fleet had been completely neutralized in seconds. Not a single person was harmed, not a scratch on any hull, but every single offensive and defensive system had been surgically disabled. It would take weeks to get them running again. By then, the Cathari would be long gone, and the humans had done it all with just 3 little ships. The story of what happened at Valen 4 shot across the galaxy like a bolt of lightning. The Council called an emergency session immediately. The Grand Chamber, which once held representatives from 412 species, was now down to 395, but the fear in the room was so thick you could taste it. "This was an act of war," roared Delegate Minara of the Hegemony. "They attacked a hegemony fleet without provocation. They defended themselves after you fired on them." High Arbiter Zilvex corrected him calmly, his multifaceted eyes blinking slowly. "And they managed to do it without causing a single casualty." "That's not the point. They have technology that can do that." Minara's arms were waving frantically. "They stopped our weapons in mid-flight. They turned our own missiles against us. They shut down 30 warships in seconds. How is that even possible?" "We should have listened to Chief Technician Aldara," someone muttered from the back of the chamber. A dead silence fell over the room. Everyone remembered the classified report they had all dismissed as science fiction. "We need answers," Zilvex finally announced. "We need to find out what humanity has been building all this time and how they did it." The Council kicked off the largest intelligence-gathering operation in its history. Spy drones tiptoed along the edges of human space. Covert agents from a dozen species were sent to dig up any scrap of information they could find. Every piece of data on human activity for the last 20 years was examined under a microscope. And what they discovered turned their entire understanding of the galaxy completely upside down. The humans hadn't been sulking in silence. They had been busy, using scientific principles that the Council's greatest minds couldn't even start to understand. Humanity had jumped forward thousands of years in technological development. It changed the entire game. One day, humans were stuck using clunky old-fashioned fusion drives, and the next, they were blinking between star systems in an instant. Their power sources seemed to ignore the known laws of physics. Suddenly, they could manufacture things thousands of times faster, and their military capabilities made the combined might of the entire Galactic Council look like a child's toy. We think they're manipulating other dimensions," the lead intelligence analyst reported, her voice shaking. "Their ships don't seem to exist entirely in our reality. It's as if they can step around the laws of physics, and their weapons, they're based on principles we don't even have words for." "How?" Minara roared. "How is this possible? They were a backwater species." The Vorthani delegate, a creature made of shimmering gel, rippled in a way that looked like admiration. "They are human," it said simply. "When you push them into a corner, they don't just fight back, they evolve. When you tell them something is impossible, they take it as a personal challenge. We gave them the greatest gift we ever could have." "What gift?" another delegate asked. "We gave them a reason to prove every single one of us wrong." And the analyst's report just kept getting worse. It wasn't only about technology. Humanity had also grown. What was once a few small colonies around a single star had become a massive network spanning dozens of worlds. The human population had exploded from 8 billion to nearly 40 billion in just 2 decades, and they had been making friends. While the Council was caught up in its endless wars and political squabbles, humanity had been quietly building alliances with species outside the Council's control. Smaller civilizations that the Council had written off as unimportant or primitive. The very same young races that were denied a seat at the table for the same reasons humanity had been kicked out. The humans had offered them a partnership, a coalition of equals instead of the Council's rigid, top-down structure. We have confirmed that at least 37 species have signed formal treaties with humanity, the analyst continued. Many have been given massive technological upgrades. Several are now becoming major powers in their own right. They're building their own council, Zilvex whispered, his gaze fixed on nothing. It certainly looks that way. The chamber exploded into chaos. Delegates were screaming at each other, pointing fingers, and throwing around wild accusations. Some demanded an immediate all-out war with humanity. Others begged for a diplomatic solution. A few even suggested they should probably just surrender now and get it over with. Zilvex let them shout for a few minutes before finally bringing his gavel down for silence. "We have a problem," he said, his voice slicing through the noise. "A very, very big problem. Humanity is now a galactic superpower, and we have absolutely no clue what to do about it." "Strike now before they strike us," Minara shrieked. "With what, you fool?" another delegate snapped back. "Were you not listening? 3 of their ships humiliated 30 of our best without breaking a sweat. Our top military analysts project that if humanity truly wanted to, they could annihilate our combined fleets in under 24 hours. Then we must negotiate, offer them whatever they want." "We've tried," Zilvex said with a heavy sigh. "They don't want anything from us." "Then what are we supposed to do?" For a long, heavy moment, Zilvex was silent. "We ask nicely," he finally said. "We're going to assemble a proper diplomatic team," the High Arbiter said. "We'll ask for a meeting. We will finally show them the respect they deserved 20 years ago." Zilvex's aide clicked his mandibles nervously. "And what if they refuse?" "Then," Zilvex replied grimly, "we pray they decide to keep being as patient and merciful as they've been so far." And so, the mission was planned with a level of care bordering on desperation. They beamed their message out into the blackness of space. Days bled into weeks. The Council, the supposed masters of the galaxy, were reduced to pacing their halls and waiting. Finally, after 2 agonizingly long months, a response arrived. It was brutally short. The United Earth Confederacy confirmed they had received the request. A meeting would be granted, time and place to be determined. You would have thought they'd just won a galactic war. The council chamber exploded with cheers and relief. They were talking. The humans were willing to talk. But a few of the older, wiser delegates saw what the younger ones missed. The humans hadn't demanded a thing. No conditions, no terms, no angry ultimatums. They simply agreed. And there was something about that calm, simple acceptance that was more terrifying than any threat they could have made. The humans weren't acting angry or scared or even all that interested. They were just willing to listen. And that somehow was the scariest thing of all. The meeting was scheduled for a station called Haven's Rest, a place that hadn't even existed 10 years ago, but was now one of the biggest structures in the known universe. It hung right on the border of human territory, a gleaming, massive city in space, with docking ports, living quarters, and grand halls built to welcome thousands of different species. It was neutral ground, belonging to neither the Council nor humanity. It was a crossroads for everyone. The Council delegation arrived with a fleet of their 50 most magnificent ships, representing the combined might of 395 species. It was meant to be a show of force, a reminder that they were still important. But as they looked at Haven's Rest, that confidence began to crumble. The station was a storm of activity. Ships of every shape and size were coming and going in a never-ending river of cosmic traffic. The hallways were a living tapestry of beings from dozens of species. Their intel said at least 70 different civilizations now traded here, and not a single one was a member of their council. High Arbiter Zilvex led his delegation through the station's humming corridors. He tried to carry himself with the dignity of his office, but his huge compound eyes couldn't stop darting around, taking in every impossible detail. Human security officers watched them pass, polite but distant, professional but with zero warmth. They gave short answers to questions and led the group to the meeting with an efficiency that felt almost dismissive. The conference room, however, was perfect. Seats were designed for the unique bodies of every single delegate, and refreshments for each species' biology were already waiting. Every diplomatic detail was flawlessly handled. The humans were already there. At the head of their side of the table sat Secretary General Elena Vasquez. She was an old woman now, her hair stark white and her face a roadmap of wrinkles. But her eyes were exactly the same as they were 23 years ago when she was laughed out of their grand chamber. Calm, impossible to read, and endlessly patient. Beside her sat Admiral James Okonkwo, the supreme commander of Earth's entire military. He was a powerfully built man whose expression revealed nothing. On her other side was Dr. Leo Wei, the chief scientist for the human government, a small woman who seemed to crackle with a quiet energy as if she was solving equations the rest of them couldn't even see. And behind them stood a solid wall of human officers and officials. Every last one of them watched the council delegates enter with that same patient, unreadable stare. Zilvex took his seat. When the room was quiet, he cleared his throat. "Secretary General Vasquez," he began. "Thank you for granting us this audience." Elena gave a tiny, almost invisible nod. "You're the ones who requested the meeting, High Arbiter. We're here to listen." Zilvex had practiced for this moment for weeks. He had speeches, arguments, and incredible offers all polished and ready to go. But staring into Elena's calm eyes, he tossed it all aside. "We were wrong," he said, the words slicing through the tense silence. A shockwave went through the room. Even his own people, who were expecting a diplomatic masterstroke, just stared at him. 23 years ago, Zilvex continued, your people came to us. You asked for a seat on the council. You presented your case with a dignity and hope that was inspiring. You didn't ask for special favors, just a fair shot to prove you belonged." He paused, his mandibles clicking softly. "And we laughed at you. 412 species, all laughing together. We called you too young, too primitive, too divided. We threw every one of your accomplishments back in your face." He spread his arms wide in a gesture of complete surrender. "We were arrogant fools." Elena just watched him, her face a perfect mask. "In the years since," Zilvex pressed on, "we've watched you. Your technology is now better than ours in almost every way. Your alliances include races we ignored for centuries, and your victory at Valenfor showed us a military power that we simply can't match." He bowed his head, a gesture of submission no High Arbiter had ever made to an outsider. "The Galactic Council formally invites humanity to become a full member with all the rights and privileges that come with it. We're offering trade pacts, scientific exchange programs, and mutual defense treaties. Everything we so cruelly refused you 23 years ago, we are now offering. It's all yours, no strings attached." He raised his head, his eyes locking with Elena's. "We are begging you, Secretary General, please." A heavy silence fell over the room once more. Every creature in the chamber held its breath, waiting to hear what humanity would say. Elena stared at Zilvex for a long, tense moment. Then she glanced over at Admiral Okonkwo and Dr. Wei. The three humans just looked at each other. Not a single word was exchanged, but in those few seconds, an entire complicated conversation seemed to pass between them. At last, Elena turned her gaze back to the council members. 23 years ago, she began, her voice quiet but ringing with clarity, I stood in your stunning grand chamber and humbly asked for a place at your table. I was speaking for a young species, one that was filled with so much excitement and hope. We just wanted to be part of something bigger, to help, to belong. She leaned forward just an inch, and you laughed at us. The sound went on for almost 10 minutes, 412 species, telling us with one voice that we were nothing. And when you were done laughing, you told us to go away for 1,000 years and try not to destroy ourselves. Zilvex's multifaceted eyes blinked. Secretary General, we realize now that we made a terrible mistake. Elena's voice was dangerously calm. Oh, you do. You've realized that 23 years too late. You realized it after we built technology that scares you, after we built an alliance you can't push around, and after we showed that we could crush your fleets without even trying. Yes, now, you see your mistake. She leaned back, the picture of cool control. The day we walked out of your chamber, humiliated, we made a promise to ourselves. We would never again depend on anyone who could throw us away so easily. We would never again beg for a seat at a table hosted by people who only understand fear. But Secretary General, our offer is genuine. We want you as our partner. I'm sure you do. Now. But what happens when our technology stops growing so fast? What if our alliance hits a rough patch? What happens when we stop being so scary? Elena shook her head slowly. Would you still want us as partners then? Or would we go back to being your amusing little primitives? Zilvex had no answer. He couldn't find one. High Arbiter, Elena said, I'm about to tell you something, and I need you to understand that I mean it with every cell in my body. She stood up, and every human at the table rose with her as one. In the silence you gave us, we built something new. Not just better ships or stronger shields. We built a civilization that measures worth by character, not by how old your species is. We built a community where you're valued for who you are, not for how long you've had spaceships. Her gaze swept across the chamber, landing on each of the council delegates. We went out and found the species you ignored, the young civilizations you wrote off, the different cultures you decided weren't worth your time. We offered them a partnership, not a hierarchy. We offered cooperation, not subordination. We showed them respect before they had to build fleets to demand it. Her eyes finally returned to Zilvex. That is the fundamental difference between us, High Arbiter. You waited until we were strong to offer us respect. We believe that every being deserves dignity right from the very start. Zilvex felt a cold dread crystallize in his thorax. So, you refuse our offer? We don't refuse it, she corrected gently. We simply have no need for it. Elena gathered her papers. The Human Concordant already counts 73 species as members. By this time next year, that number will be well over 100. We already have everything we came to you for 23 years ago. Community, partnership, a sense of belonging. We just built it ourselves, with friends who valued us back when we had nothing. Then why did you even agree to this meeting? Zilvex asked, his voice strained. Elena paused at the doorway. For the very first time, a flicker of something that might have been warmth touched her eyes. Because we are not you, she said softly. We are not going to laugh at you. We won't mock you as you decline or find joy in your struggles. We remember exactly how that feels. She turned to face the entire council delegation. The Galactic Council is welcome to send observers to any concordant proceedings. Individual council species are free to apply for membership in the concordant, but know that they will be judged by the exact same standards as every other applicant. And if you ever face a threat like the Thresh again, we will step in to defend innocent lives, no matter their political affiliation. But you will not join the council. No, she said, we will not. Elena's expression was gentle, yet absolutely unyielding. You told us to go develop in peaceful isolation. Well, you got your wish. We developed, we found peace, and we are perfectly content with our isolation from you. She turned and walked out the door, the other humans following her in silence. Zilvex remained frozen in his chair. Around him, the collective diplomatic power of 395 species sat in absolute stunned silence. They had offered humanity the galaxy on a silver platter. Full membership, exclusive trade rights, a military alliance, a formal apology for their past sins, and humanity had just calmly turned and walked away. Again. The long journey back to council space was eerily quiet. The delegates hardly exchanged a word. What was there left to say? They had failed on a scale they couldn't comprehend, not because of a war or a breakdown in negotiations, but because of something far more soul-crushing. Humanity simply didn't care about them anymore. For 11,000 years, the Galactic Council had been the undisputed center of the civilized galaxy. Every species that mattered was either a member or desperately wanted to be. The Council's acceptance was the ultimate prize. Its rejection meant a lonely slide into irrelevance. And now, suddenly, there was another option. A rapidly growing alliance founded on principles the Council had never even bothered to consider. A community that didn't give a damn about how old you were, how advanced your tech was, or whether you ate plants or slept for half the day. And humanity, the species they had laughed out of the room, was at the very heart of it all. Zilvex spent the entire trip home thinking about Elena Vasquez, about the hopeful young woman who had asked for nothing more than a chance, and the powerful old woman she had become, who now held the galaxy's future in her hands. Her eyes held nothing but a deep, unyielding patience. The Council had done this to them. They'd taken a young, hopeful species and slammed them with a brutal lesson in galactic politics. They showed humanity exactly what kind of respect they could expect from the older, established civilizations. And humanity learned that lesson perfectly. They learned that respect wasn't given freely out of kindness. It had to be taken through power. They learned that the strong always dismiss the weak. They learned that ancient history and advanced tech meant more than character or potential. And after learning all that, humanity decided to build something completely different. That's what stung the most, Zilvex finally understood. It wasn't that humanity had blown past them in technology. It wasn't that they'd built a rival alliance. It was that they had taken the Council's own cynical lessons and thrown them in the trash. The Council had taught humanity that the strong should mock the weak. So, humanity decided to become strong and still be kind. And now, 23 years too late, the Council was finally discovering what it felt like to be on the other side of that lesson. When the delegation got back to the Council station, they walked into the Grand Chamber to find total chaos. Word of the failed meeting had somehow already gotten out. Different species were yelling at each other. Fingers were being pointed. Some blamed Zilvex for the diplomatic disaster. Others blamed the species who had laughed the loudest 23 years ago. A quiet few blamed the entire Council system itself. Zilvex just watched over the shouting match with a tired sense of defeat. Let them argue. Let them point fingers. It didn't change a thing. Humanity had built something new. Something that didn't need the Council's permission slip. Something that was growing every day while the Council was shrinking. And there wasn't a single thing any of them could do about it. The era of the Galactic Council was coming to a close. A new age was dawning, and humanity, the very species they had written off as worthless primitives, was going to be right at the center of it. Zilvex looked up at the massive crystalline ceiling of the Grand Chamber. 11,000 years of history. 11,000 years of believing they were the heart of the civilized galaxy. All of it was turning to dust because 23 years ago they had laughed at the wrong species, and now it was far, far too late to take it back. 50 years had passed since the day the galaxy laughed at Earth. Now it was a global holiday. Every single year on that anniversary, humans and their allies would pause to remember the day that set them on a new path. It was a story taught in schools. Museums were filled with exhibits from that era. And the grandparents who were just kids when they saw that Council broadcast live would tell the story to their grandchildren. The galaxy had been reshaped in ways nobody could have predicted. And the Galactic Council? Well, on paper, it was still around. The massive crystal towers of the Council station still reached toward their man-made sun. The delegates still gathered in the Grand Chamber to hold their debates and cast their votes. But these days, that magnificent chamber was more than half empty. Species had left, not in a big rush, but in a slow, steady trickle over the decades. Some had joined the human concordat outright. Others had just drifted away, no longer seeing any point in being a council member. A few had collapsed completely, unable to keep up with the new galactic order. High Arbiter Zilvex was still in his position. He was ancient now, even for his long-lived species. His shell had grown dull with age, and his movements were slow and deliberate, but his compound eyes still shone with intelligence, and his mind was as sharp as ever. He now presided over a council of 112 species, less than a third of what it had been in its golden age. And today's session was especially humiliating. The motion to request observer status in the human concordat is now on the floor, Zilvex announced. It was the Council's 5th time making this request. The last 4 had been politely acknowledged and then completely ignored. No rejection, no acceptance, just silence. It was a political trick humanity had learned from them. The vote passed without a single objection. Of course it did. What other choice did they have? The Concordat now had over 200 member species. Its economy made the councils look tiny. Its technology was generations ahead of theirs. Its core principles of equality and mutual respect were constantly attracting new members. The council was becoming a relic, and everybody knew it. After the session, Zilvex walked alone through the station's corridors. He did this a lot lately, just walking and remembering. He remembered the Grand Chamber in its prime, packed with representatives from 412 species. He remembered the absolute confidence they all felt, the certainty that they were the center of the civilized universe. He remembered laughing at a young human woman who had the nerve to ask for a seat at their table. He wondered, and not for the first time, what might have happened if they had just said yes. If they had welcomed humanity, guided them, given them a chance to prove their worth within the system. Would things be different now? Probably. Almost certainly. But they hadn't done that. They had laughed, and now they were living with the consequences. All the way across the galaxy, on a station named Concordat Prime, a very different kind of meeting was happening. The Human Concordat's annual assembly brought together representatives from 217 species. They came from every corner of the galaxy, young civilizations and ancient ones, massive species and tiny beings made of flesh and energy and silicon and things that were hard to even describe. This meeting wasn't held in some massive, intimidating chamber designed to make you feel small. Instead, it was in a simple hall built for comfort and collaboration. There were no special platforms for the so-called important species, no seating chart that ranked everyone by power or age. Here, every delegate was an equal, sitting at the very same level. From the entrance, Admiral Sarah Chen watched them all arrive. The years had turned her hair snow white, and her body carried the weight of a long life in service, but she stood as straight as ever. Her eyes, however, had lost none of their sharpness. She had witnessed things most people couldn't even imagine, devastating wars and hard-won peace, crushing tragedies and glorious triumphs, and she'd watched a new galactic order being born from the ashes of the old, and she never, ever forgot how it all began. A young Vorthani approached her. His name was Trinex, the first of his species born free from the Council's control. His parents had been pioneers, among the first Vorthani to abandon the ancient council that had ruled their people for millennia and join the new Concordat. "Admiral Chen," he said, his gelatinous form quivering with deep respect. "It is a true honor to finally meet you." Sarah offered a warm smile. "The honor is all mine, delegate. The work you've done on the integration committee is nothing short of brilliant." Praise made Trinex ripple with delight. "I had the best teachers. Human schools taught me that every voice matters. My parents weren't raised with that idea." "Well, times are changing," Sarah said. "Yes, they are. Thanks to your people," Trinex replied, then hesitated for a moment. "Admiral, if it's okay, could I ask you something?" "Of course." "Is the story true? The one they called the Day of Laughter? Did the Council really humiliate humanity that badly?" Sarah's smile tightened just a bit. "It's true. I wasn't in the room, but I saw the recording. Sooner or later, the entire galaxy did. It just seems unbelievable. How could they have been so arrogant?" Sarah's gaze swept over the hall, filled with delegates from species the Council had once called worthless. Every one of them was now here, working together as partners. "They weren't blind," she finally answered. "They were just certain. For 11,000 years, they were the center of the universe. They couldn't fathom a reality where they might be wrong." "And then you showed them they were," Trinex said. "Not just me," Sarah corrected softly, gesturing to the vibrant assembly. "All of us. It was everyone who believed that strength doesn't give you the right to be cruel. Everyone who chose to build something new instead of just complaining about the old." Trinex fell silent for a moment. "So what happens with the Council now? I heard they've requested observer status again." "That's right." "Are you going to approve it this time?" It was a question Sarah had heard before. The Council had been sending these requests for years, and each time the Concordat leadership would discuss it and decide the time wasn't right. It wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was because, in the Concordat, observer status was a serious commitment. It meant a species was truly ready to listen, to change, and to embrace a new way of thinking. Was the council actually ready for that kind of humility? "That's not my decision to make alone," Sarah said after a pause. "The entire assembly will decide." "But how would you vote?" Trinex pressed gently. Sarah was quiet for a long time, thinking. She thought of all the years of being dismissed, of the Valen 4 incident, of pointless meetings and hollow apologies that were always decades too late. She thought of Elena Vasquez, who had passed on 10 years ago, a hero mourned by over 100 different species. Elena was the one who had walked out of that chamber in dignified silence, then dedicated her life to creating something better than the broken system that had rejected her. What would Elena do? The answer was suddenly crystal clear. "I would vote yes," Sarah said, "not because they've earned it, but because of who we are. We decided to give everyone a chance, even those who once mocked us." Trinex rippled, stunned. "Even after all they did?" "Especially after all they did," Sarah replied, turning to look him in the eye. "The council's way was for the strong to ridicule the weak. We chose a different path. The moment we start punishing others for failing to meet our standards, we become just like them." She looked back at the assembly hall, where delegates from 217 different species were finding their seats. "Besides," she added in a softer voice, "they've suffered enough. They had to sit back and watch their entire empire crumble while we thrived. For people like them, that's more than enough punishment." The assembly began a few minutes later, with hundreds of delegates debating trade agreements, joint scientific ventures, and mutual defense treaties. Big decisions required total agreement, not a simple majority vote. Disagreements were resolved with conversation, not by shows of force. Toward the end of the day, the council's request for observer status was brought to the floor. The debate was surprisingly brief. A few delegates spoke against it. Some wounds were still raw, but the vast majority shared the view Sarah had expressed to Trinex. They had built their Concordat on the ideals of inclusion and respect. To deny the council a chance to learn would be a betrayal of everything they stood for. The choice became obvious. They would grant observer status. The council would be welcomed, not as the galaxy's former masters, but as students, as beginners, as a people who, if they could find it in themselves to be humble, might one day find a new home in this new galactic order. This wasn't about payback. This wasn't about punishment. It was simply about the Concordat being true to its principles and choosing to be better. On the council's main station, High Arbiter Zilvex received the message. He had to read it 3 times because he was sure he was misinterpreting the words. They had actually approved it. After all the begging, after all the years of being ignored, the same way his council had once ignored them, humanity had finally said yes. Zilvex was overcome with a strange mix of emotions. First came a massive wave of relief. This was the lifeline the council had been desperate for. But something else followed close behind. A deeply uncomfortable, creeping feeling that felt an awful lot like shame. They were being offered a second chance, not because they deserved it or had earned it back, but simply because the Concordat was being gracious. The council had once cast humanity aside for being too young, too weak, and too different. Now, the Concordat was accepting the council despite all of its unforgivable actions. It was the absolute reverse of every core belief the council had ever held. And that simple act of mercy, somehow, made Zilvex feel 100 times smaller than a flat-out rejection ever could have.